8 feet, 11 inches. That number stopped me cold. Not the height of a doorframe. Not the ceiling of a standard room. 8 feet, 11 inches, the recorded height of a human skeleton, excavated from American soil, catalogued by a county historical society, and then quietly removed from every official record within a generation. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was working through a series of 19th-century newspaper archives, the kind of primary source research that takes weeks of screen time and leaves your eyes burning, when the patterns started to emerge. Not one report. Not two. Hundreds of them. Spanning decades. Spanning continents of American geography. Spanning publications that had no reason to coordinate a fabrication. And then I started looking for the physical evidence. The bones. The photographs. The institutional records. And they were gone. Not misplaced. Not misfiled. Gone in ways that feel less like administrative failure and more like administrative intention. The part that keeps me up at night is not what was found. It is what happened after. Let me start with a number, 1,500. That is the rough count of giant skeleton reports, defined here as human remains measuring 7 feet or taller, that researchers have catalogued from American newspapers published between 1800 and 1940. 1,500 reports. From professional excavations. From amateur discoveries. From federal surveys and county coroner reports and museum intake logs. That number hit me before the implications did. The reports come from Ohio, from Wisconsin, from New York, from California, from the mounds of the Mississippi River Valley and the burial complexes of the Carolina Piedmont. They describe remains that do not fit the standard archaeological model of pre-Columbian North America, remains that are, in some cases, dramatically outside the range of ordinary human variation. My doorway into this story was a filing cabinet. Specifically, the filing cabinet of a retired newspaper archivist in the Midwest, a man I will call Harold, who had spent 30 years cataloging regional historical records before retirement gave him time to notice something. He told me, I kept finding these reports. And then I kept finding that the things they reported on, I couldn't find those things anywhere. Not in the museums. Not in the universities. Not in any storage facility I could locate. Harold is not a conspiracy theorist. He is a cataloger. A professional noticer of gaps. And the gaps, as I would come to understand, are the story. The stakes here are significant. If even a fraction of these reports describe genuine physical evidence, they represent a fundamental challenge to established narratives about who built the ancient structures of North America, how large pre-Columbian populations were, and what the Smithsonian Institution, the largest museum complex in the world, funded by the federal government, has done with biological evidence that does not fit comfortable categories. That is a large claim. I want to be fair to the official narrative before I challenge it. The official story goes like this. Native American populations of pre-Columbian North America were, in terms of physical stature, broadly consistent with modern human variation. Archaeological evidence gathered over a century of professional excavation supports average height ranges not dramatically different from those seen in contemporary populations. The mound-building cultures of the Midwest, the Hopewell tradition, the Adena complex, the later Mississippian societies, were sophisticated societies, yes, but their builders were ordinary human beings of ordinary human proportions. The newspaper reports of giant skeletons, in this framing, are a product of their time. The 19th century was an era of extraordinary archaeological enthusiasm combined with extraordinary archaeological naivety. Measurements were taken by amateurs without proper instruments. Remains were attributed to giants because the bones were large, but large by the standards of men who ate poorly and rarely exceeded 5.5 feet. A robust 6'2" skeleton might genuinely have appeared monstrous to a frontier farmer who had never seen a professional athlete. And then there is the cultural context. America in the 1800s was obsessed with the idea that a superior pre-Indian civilization had built the mounds. It was a convenient belief, one that conveniently diminished the cultural achievements of living Native American populations. Giant skeletons fit neatly into this narrative. They were eagerly reported. They were probably, in many cases, exaggerated. This is the mainstream explanation. It is reasonable. It is internally consistent. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only the very human tendency to see what we expect to see, and to tell stories that serve our needs. Let me be fair to that explanation. It is worth taking seriously. But here's what matters: taking it seriously means testing it against the evidence. And when I tested it against the evidence, certain things did not add up. Let's start with the numbers. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846. Its Bureau of Ethnology, later the Bureau of American Ethnology, began systematic archaeological fieldwork shortly thereafter. By the 1870s and 1880s, Smithsonian-affiliated researchers were excavating mound sites across the eastern United States on an unprecedented scale. Here is what the Smithsonian's own annual reports from that period document. The Bureau of Ethnology recovered thousands of sets of human remains from mound sites across Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and surrounding states. These remains were catalogued. They were transported to Washington, D.C. They were stored in the Smithsonian's collections. The 1881 annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology describes excavations conducted by Smithsonian researcher Cyrus Thomas and his team across more than 2,000 mound sites. The report notes, in its clinical bureaucratic language, the recovery of remains exhibiting unusual characteristics in terms of skeletal dimensions. Speaking of Cyrus Thomas, there is something worth pausing on. His own field notes, housed, or once housed, in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives, describe individual specimens with measurements that significantly exceed the range of ordinary human variation. The question is not whether Thomas took these measurements. His handwriting is there. Or was there. The question is where the specimens themselves went. Which brings me to the Smithsonian's own accounting problem. In 2001, after years of litigation and negotiation under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, the Smithsonian began the formal process of cataloging and returning Native American remains to tribal nations. This process revealed something that had not been publicly acknowledged. The institution held, at that time, the skeletal remains of approximately 18,500 individuals. 18,500 human beings, sitting in storage. The timeline isn't subtle. NAGPRA was passed in 1990. The Smithsonian's repatriation process began in earnest in the early 2000s. By 2015, the institution acknowledged that significant portions of its skeletal collection were inadequately documented, meaning the records connecting physical specimens to their excavation reports were incomplete, corrupted, or missing entirely. That's not administrative failure. That's a documentation crisis at the world's largest museum complex, specifically centered on the category of evidence most relevant to the question of anomalous skeletal remains. Let me be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed evidence of giant skeletons to protect an archaeological orthodoxy. I am saying that the institution that holds the most extensive collection of pre-Columbian human remains in the world has, by its own admission, significant gaps in the documentation connecting those remains to the field reports that originally described them. What those field reports described is a matter of record. The New York Times, not a tabloid, not a fringe publication, but the newspaper of record for the American establishment, published, on May 4, 1912, a dispatch from Lake Delavan in Wisconsin. The report describes the excavation of a burial mound by researchers from the Beloit College Archaeology Department. It describes the recovery of 18 skeletons, the smallest of which measured just over 7 feet. The skulls, the report notes, were of an unusual elongated shape, with prominent brow ridges and double rows of teeth in the upper jaw. The Beloit College Natural History Museum catalog for that period exists. The entry for the Lake Delavan excavation exists. The skeletons themselves do not appear in any subsequent inventory. Speaking of Wisconsin, there is the earlier case of the 1891 excavation at Aztalan, the Mississippian culture site near Lake Mills. State Historical Society records from that year document the recovery of remains described by the site's excavators as belonging to individuals of exceptional stature. Those records sit in the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. The specimens they describe have never been publicly exhibited or accounted for. Which brings me to the Smithsonian's own correspondence files. In 1881, Smithsonian researcher P.W. Norris wrote to Bureau Director John Wesley Powell from an excavation site in the mounds near Dunleith, Illinois. Norris's letter, which I found in the National Anthropological Archives under collection number 4822, describes the recovery of what he calls remains of unusual character, including skeletal material he estimates at 8 to 9 feet in total height. Norris asks Powell for guidance on how to catalog and transport the specimens. Powell's response, if it existed, is not in that file. The file jumps from Norris's 1881 inquiry to a 1883 summary report that makes no mention of the Dunleith specimens. That gap is 4 pages in the finding aid. 4 pages that have been removed, or were never filed, or degraded. The archivist who helped me could not determine which. What she could determine was that the gap was not original to the collection. Someone, at some point, had worked with these files. The timing is almost theatrical. The Smithsonian's aggressive mound excavation program peaked between 1882 and 1892. The most detailed newspaper reports of anomalous skeletal discoveries cluster in exactly that decade. The institutional records from that decade are, in the areas most relevant to anomalous specimens, the most fragmentary. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe a decade of aggressive field collection simply produced a decade of aggressive documentation failures. Maybe the specimens Norris described in that 1881 letter were perfectly ordinary remains that he measured incorrectly, and Powell's response simply said as much and the response was discarded as routine correspondence. Maybe. But here's what matters: there is a third category of evidence. One that bypasses both the newspaper reports and the institutional records entirely. And that evidence is the oral tradition of Native American communities themselves. The Paiute people of the Great Basin have a tradition, well documented by ethnographers going back to the late 19th century, of a red-haired race of giants called the Ctcah, who inhabited the region before being destroyed in warfare. This tradition was not invented after the newspaper reports. It predates sustained European contact in the region. In 1924, guano miners excavating a cave called Lovelock Cave in Humboldt County, Nevada, found human remains. Some of the remains were documented by the University of California at Berkeley and the Nevada Historical Society. The documentation noted remains of individuals of larger than typical stature, with, in several cases, reddish or reddish-brown hair still attached to the skulls. The Lovelock Cave materials were split between 2 institutions, Berkeley and the Nevada State Museum. In the decade since, the records of which specimens were recovered, and what their precise measurements were, have become, you will not be surprised to hear, contested and incomplete. The Nevada State Museum acknowledges holding Lovelock materials. Berkeley's Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology acknowledges holding Lovelock materials. Neither institution has made the full specimen inventory publicly available. Let me step back and name what I am seeing. There is a category of pre-Columbian archaeological discovery, anomalous skeletal remains of unusual stature, recovered from mound sites and cave deposits across North America, that was extensively documented in the 19th and early 20th century by mainstream sources, government institutions, state historical societies, Smithsonian-affiliated researchers, and major newspapers. There is a pattern of those reports not being followed by any publicly accessible physical specimen. The bones are not in the museums. They are not in storage facilities. They are not available for study. There is a parallel pattern of archival fragmentation specifically around the records that would connect excavation reports to institutional collections, gaps, removed pages, incomplete finding aids, inadequate documentation. And there is a third parallel. Every time a researcher attempts to follow the chain of evidence from a specific newspaper report to a specific institutional holding, they encounter the same sequence: acknowledgement that the excavation occurred, acknowledgement that specimens were collected, absence of those specimens from any locatable collection. Maybe I am seeing patterns where none exist. But parallel patterns in parallel domains: journalism, institutional archives, museum collections, oral tradition, ethnographic documentation, that all point in the same direction are not typically the signature of random variation. Consider the parallel case of the Cardiff Giant, the famous 1869 hoax, a 10-foot carved stone figure, discovered in upstate New York and immediately debunked as a fraud. The Cardiff Giant is frequently cited as evidence that Americans of this era were credulous about giant remains and easily fooled. And that is true. Americans of that era were certainly credulous. But the Cardiff Giant was stone. It was not bone. And its rapid exposure as a hoax suggests that the system of scientific scrutiny that existed in 1869 was capable of identifying fabrications. That same system of scrutiny produced the newspaper reports I am describing, reports by geologists, by Bureau of Ethnology researchers, by State Historical Society members who were professionals operating in a community that had just exposed the Cardiff Giant. The pattern also appears in the institutional record of the Smithsonian's own policies. In 2012, a researcher named Richard Dewhurst, working with private collections and State Historical Society archives, filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests with the Smithsonian requesting documentation of its pre-1920 skeletal collections from specific mound sites. The Smithsonian's responses, which are public record, acknowledged the existence of collection records while noting that many were in the process of digitization and not yet available for external review. As of 2024, those specific records remain unavailable. The archive still exists. Somewhere in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives, in boxes that have not been digitized, in filing cabinets that have not been opened for external review, there are field notes and correspondence and intake logs from a decade of the most extensive mound excavation program in American history. And once you see the shape of that gap, you cannot unsee it. I want to return to where I started. Harold, the retired archivist, told me something near the end of our conversations that I keep returning to. He said, "The thing about archives is that you can always tell the difference between a gap and an absence. A gap is when something went missing. An absence is when something was never supposed to be there in the first place. These feel like absences. I do not have answers. I want to be honest about that. I cannot tell you definitively that 8-foot human skeletons were excavated from Wisconsin mounds and transported to Washington and placed in Smithsonian storage and then destroyed or hidden. I cannot tell you that. The evidence does not permit that certainty. What I can tell you is that there is a body of 19th-century documentation, produced by credentialed researchers and mainstream institutions, describing the recovery of anomalous human remains from pre-Columbian North American sites. I can tell you that those remains are not publicly accounted for. I can tell you that the archival record connecting those remains to their institutional destinations is fragmented in ways that professional archivists find unusual. I can tell you that Native American oral traditions, independently recorded before the era of the newspaper reports, describe populations of unusual stature in the regions where the excavations took place. I can tell you that there is a law, NAGPRA, specifically designed to create accountability for the human remains held by institutions like the Smithsonian, and that even under that law, with its legal requirements for transparency and documentation, 18,500 individuals spent decades in Smithsonian storage without adequate records. What happened to the bones? I don't know. What happened to the files? I don't know. But I know that somewhere in a filing cabinet in the National Anthropological Archives, there is a gap between an 1881 letter from P.W. Norris describing remains of unusual character and an 1883 summary report that never mentions them again. 4 pages. And whatever was on those 4 pages, someone decided the rest of US didn't need to see. Maybe that someone had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And once you see them, you know the rest.